So welcome back. Today we'll be talking about writing after stroke. And if you look back in human history, the oldest evidence we have of writing comes from the ancient Sumerians around 3400 BC. They wrote in what we now call the cuneiform script, and it was very complex. It took the average Sumerian about 8 to 12 years to learn it. However, they understood the importance of writing down what is being said and to pass that information along to others. And if you look at the action of writing from a neurological standpoint, it involves a lot of different parts of the body. So if you take the example of we have a piece of paper and we're going to write something, the eye has to see where the paper starts, where it ends, how the hand is holding the pencil, etc. Has to send that information back to the brain, and the brain has to process it. And it uses a lot of different parts. It uses the language center, the word center, the creative, the memory, etc. And then it will send the right signal back down to the hand, and then the hand will make the letter or the word. And the eye then looks at that, sends that information back to the brain so it can kind of autocorrect it in real time. And this whole loop where it goes from the eye to the brain to the hand to the eye again, back to the brain, back to the hand, this whole loop is called the visuomotor loop. And the signals that are being sent around this loop are very quick. It's about 600 times a minute, so it's very quick. It involves many different parts of the brain. So it's understandable that after a stroke, a lot of patients struggle with writing. And in fact, that sudden loss of writing after a stroke, the fancy word for that is called agraphia from Greek. And it comes in two types. It can be partial, which means they can't write some things, or it can be complete, where they can't write at all. And there are studies that show that up to half of patients after a stroke, like 50%, will have trouble writing. And how I found out that I could no longer write after my own stroke was actually kind of funny. I was in the rehab hospital, and one of the rehab therapists said, write a letter. And I was like, okay, what letter do you want me to write? Like, just write a letter to a friend. It can just be just a casual letter. I'm like, okay. So I wrote, Dear Dina, I am fine. I hope you are well. Thanks, Sheba. And I looked up at the therapist and said, I'm done. And the therapist said, are you sure? And my brain knew that the ending, I didn't land correctly, but that's okay. I thought the rest of the letter was fine. But the therapist said, why don't you look at the letter and see if there's any spelling mistakes? I'm like, okay. So I looked down at the letter and there was nothing written. It was just a bunch of squiggly lines. It was the squiggly lines that showed like, hey, where I was writing. It was basically my hand hadn't gripped the pencil, and my eye, even though I'd given the correct information to the brain had basically filled in the gaps. But then the second time when the brain looked down and it was actually processing what it was seeing, it could see those squiggly lines. And as a doctor, I thought that was very interesting. Actually, the first thing I thought when I looked at that as a doctor was like, Houston, we have a problem because that visuomotor loop has been interrupted. But then the second thing I thought was, this is very interesting. But as a person who got a prize in 5th grade for their penmanship, as a doctor who had always been told by their patients, like, wow, you don't write like a doctor, it was kind of crushing. So after this, I kind of went into doctor mode and I thought, okay, how do I get my writing back after this stroke? So I took the bigger problem, the whole visuomotor loop, and I tried to break it down into small pieces. And I figured if I could work on each piece, maybe the bigger problem would take care of itself. And so in this case, the two big pieces I broke it down into were mental, which was the brain, and then the physical, which was the hand. So my goal was to try to make this whole process more automatic for both parts, the brain and the hand. Make it so that the brain didn't have to think too much, it didn't have to reach so far back into its memory or its processing systems, and that the hand, if I could use it enough, then it would know where to go without kind of having every impulse sent by the brain to do so. So basically, the way I got my writing back after the stroke, I first started to read because I figured if the brain could see normal sentences and could see sentence structure, it wouldn't have to think about sending that signal or sending that correct signal down to the hand each time. It would just be automatic for it. So I started reading everything. And then the second thing I did was I basically, whatever they taught me in rehab, I just did the same thing. I just did it like 1,000 times more. So one of my favorite things was I call alternating alphabets, but the fancy phrase for that is interleaved practice with categorical switching. And this is where you just take a piece of paper and you write, with lines on it. And I would write like, the alphabet A, B, C, D, all the way down to Z. And what you do is like, the first letter is one category, the second letter is another category, the third letter is the same category as the first, and the fourth letter is the same category as the second, and so on and so forth. So to give you an example, if you're switching between like animals and non-animals, right? So like animals and like living things and non-living things. So the A for apple, B for bear, C for chalk, D for donkey. And I would actually do this 3 times a day for 10 minutes each. And I did this for like 60 days straight when I got back home. And so my brain was constantly working on how to do this, and my hand was getting better and better at writing. The other thing I did was I did these adult coloring books that my friend Dina, the recipient of the squiggly letter, had given me. And she had given me this adult coloring book with a bunch of colored pencils. And so what I would do is I would, again, 3 times a day, 10 minutes each time, I would sit down and I would color. And my focus was to try to stay within the lines and to pick the right color combination. And actually, I have some pictures of this on my website. So you can see, like right after the stroke, it was squiggly lines and my coloring was all over the place. But, a few months of dedicated rehab, you can see that progress. You can see that difference. And it's pretty amazing. Now, when I went back to work as a doctor, I use what I call a bunch of little tricks to try to get around the fact that I can write. It's just not as fast or as easy as it used to be. So the first thing I do is I use a lot of abbreviations. So, X for x-rays, SH for shoulders, FE for feet, like that. And the other thing I do is I use hand warmers because I feel like when I warm up my hands, I think the electrical impulses kind of travel a little bit faster down those neurons, and so my fingers become more nimble. And the other thing I do is I really pay attention to the patient, like 100%, because I am trying to memorize everything they say and everything that I see on their body. And I'm trying to do this long enough so that I can go back to my workstation and dictate my note and hopefully catch everything that happened in the visit itself. And as you can tell, this is actually very mentally exhausting. It reminds me of when, many moons ago, when I would read these short stories with Sherlock Holmes in them, and you're trying to pay attention to the right details, and so that you can put it together. And so it's kind of like reading a very intricate short story where you're kind of writing the beginning, the middle, and the end, within that few minutes. And as a lot of stroke survivors have, and I have this issue too, is when I get mentally overwhelmed, like when my brain gets mentally exhausted, my physical deficits start to show up. So, I will have trouble speaking, I will have trouble walking, I start to limp, I have trouble with balance, etc. So even though I'm trying to memorize all of this, I'm trying to do all this, in the back of my mind, there's that worry that, hey, did I miss something? Did I not catch something? Or am I not speaking clearly? Can the patient still understand me? And all that stuff. Which is why I've actually started using a lot of AI in clinic today. And I know, because I was one of those people that whenever I heard about artificial intelligence in medicine, I would feel like this disturbance in the forest. And I remember that. But now it's very nice because it removes some of that mental stress for me, because the program records what is going on in the clinic visit, it processes it, and by the time I make it back to my workstation, it has documented everything. And so then I don't worry about missing anything crucial. So I don't have to worry about writing anything. It's taken like the stress or half the workload off of my brain. So it's definitely improved, like, the patient experience from my end anyway, like, because I can feel I can be more relaxed when I talk to the patient. And also it's increased my productivity. It's made me feel much more useful. You should say I can do a lot more in the same amount of time. And for somebody who, again, I'm going to date myself here, for somebody who grew up before the time of the internet, For somebody who had to trek to the library to look up things in the encyclopedia before they turned in that book report, having all these gizmos today is pretty amazing. These electronic devices, these AI things, these writing programs, etc. But personally, I will say that I feel the best and probably the cheapest way to rewire that brain after stroke is through the act of writing itself. As the German philosopher Immanuel Kant said, the hand is the visible part of the brain. Until next time.